James's palms were damp as he clutched the folder of achievements that had defined his career. Inside that folder, years of sacrifice, late nights, and unrelenting dedication to his craft had been carefully assembled, a testament to his relentless pursuit of excellence. Today was supposed to be the culmination of it all. The promotion he deserved. The recognition he had earned. But as he sat across from his manager, the sterile silence of the office seemed to swallow any hope he'd brought with him. "James," the manager began, his tone practiced and almost sympathetic. "We value everything you've done for the company." But there it was, that small, dangerous word. "But," James felt his stomach tighten as the man's next words landed with precision. "Leadership requires a certain presence. You might not fit the mold." In that moment, James's world cracked just slightly. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight they carried. A dismissal of his efforts. A judgment not on his work, but on who he was. And James knew it. He didn't need to ask what presence or mold meant. The message was clear. His skin color was his disqualifier. How often does this happen? A black man, a woman, or anyone from a marginalized community is told they don't fit the mold. How often are their accomplishments pushed aside, their voices ignored, their dreams deferred? But what happens? What happens when one man decides to fight back? When he peels back the layers of systemic bias and discovers something far darker and more sinister than he ever imagined? James was the kind of employee every company claims to value. Impeccably sharp, hardworking, and deeply committed to his team's success. For years, he had poured himself into his work, solving problems no one else could and quietly mentoring younger employees who looked up to him. At home, he was just as committed, balancing spreadsheets and bedtime stories, client calls and science fair projects, all while ensuring his family never felt like they came second. But as much as James believed in his abilities, he'd learned to live with the weight of being underestimated. It was a burden he carried quietly, but today it felt heavier than ever. Maria, on the other hand, had grown used to the game. She'd seen it play out before. A Latina in a corporate world dominated by men who looked nothing like her, she understood the rules, even if she didn't agree with them. The unspoken rules that whispered, "Don't push too hard. Don't challenge too much. Be grateful for what you have." But Maria wasn't the type to stay silent, especially when she saw someone as talented as James being sidelined. She had warned him, hinted at the bias, but even she couldn't have predicted just how far the system would go to keep people like them in their place. Then, there was Richard. To the world outside the company, Richard was the epitome of a modern leader, polished, charismatic, and vocal about his company's so-called commitment to diversity. On stage, he'd preach about inclusion, throwing around buzzwords like equality and equity with practiced ease. But behind closed doors, Richard was a different man. His smile was a facade, his words a smokescreen, and his actions a carefully crafted strategy to ensure the status quo remained untouched. He saw people like James and Maria not as assets, but as liabilities, threats to a system he was determined to preserve. And then there was Diane, the quiet observer, an HR officer who had seen enough to know that what was happening wasn't just unfair, it was wrong. But Diane had bills to pay, a family to support, and a career she couldn't afford to lose. She saw the injustices, heard the whispers, and read between the lines. But speaking out, that was dangerous. And yet there was something about James's determination that began to make her question the silence she had chosen for so long. The boardroom was filled with energy that morning, the kind of palpable excitement that comes with a major announcement. James sat toward the back, his notebook open, ready to share an idea he had spent weeks refining. As the discussion moved to his department, he raised his hand, his voice steady and confident, as he presented a proposal he knew could take the company to new heights. The room fell silent for a moment, and then Richard spoke. "Interesting idea, James. We'll come back to it." But they didn't. Not that day, not that week. It wasn't until a month later, during a high-profile event, that James saw his idea again, only this time. It wasn't his name attached to it. Richard had taken the credit. The applause was thunderous, and James sat in the audience, his chest tightening with frustration and disbelief. But this was only the beginning. The announcement came on a bright Monday morning, during an all-hands meeting. The room buzzed with anticipation as employees settled into their seats, hoping their names might be called. James sat at the edge of his chair, heart racing, imagining what this moment might mean for him and his family. He'd been preparing for weeks, not just for the role, but for the life it would unlock, a chance to finally breathe, to move past the countless obstacles he had faced simply for existing in a space not built for him. But when the name was called, It wasn't James's. It was Ethan, a newer, less experienced white colleague who had barely scratched the surface of the work James had mastered. The applause felt like knives, each clap a reminder of what James had lost. Ethan grinned, shaking hands with Richard, who patted him on the back like a proud father. James stared straight ahead, his expression blank, his hands gripping the edges of his chair to keep from shaking. In his mind, a single thought replayed, not again. By the time James left the office that evening, his emotions were a whirlwind. He sat in his car, the world around him fading into the background. His chest tightened as memories flooded in moments from his past when he'd faced similar dismissals, subtle rejections masked as polite advice, teachers who had doubted his potential, managers who had overlooked his contributions, even strangers who had assumed he didn't belong. Each memory was a weight, pressing him further into his seat. In the stillness of his car, James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands trembled as anger, disappointment, and self-doubt clashed within him. He thought of his family, the dreams he had for them, the sacrifices they had made so he could chase this career. Was it all for nothing? He whispered, his voice breaking. But deep down, he knew the answer. It wasn't for nothing. Not yet. Later that evening, Maria called. Her voice, warm and steady, pulled James out of his spiral. She had heard the news, and she wasn't surprised. "James, I know how you're feeling," she said softly. "I've been there. It's like the system is designed to keep us out." She shared her own stories, projects stolen, promotions denied, her voice ignored in meetings. But there was something in her tone, a quiet defiance that gave James pause. "You can't let this break you," she said. "Document everything, every slight, every word. You're not imagining this, James. And if you're brave enough to fight, you won't be alone." The next morning, James arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. He started paying closer attention, watching how Richard interacted with employees, how decisions were made, and who was consistently passed over. Patterns began to emerge. James noticed that almost every leadership position was held by someone who looked like Richard White, male, and seemingly chosen less for talent and more for fitting the mold. During the coffee break, James overheard a conversation between two co-workers. One of them, a longtime employee, mentioned how the company had a reputation for quietly sidelining minorities. "It's not official, of course," she said with a shrug. "But look around. The evidence is there." Those words stuck with James as he began digging deeper. He reviewed old promotion announcements, noting the glaring absence of diversity. His suspicions grew stronger. Then, an anonymous email arrived in his inbox. The subject line read, "You're not crazy. Here's the proof." Attached were leaked HR records that revealed a troubling pattern. Minority employees consistently received lower performance scores compared to their white counterparts, even when their contributions were equal or better. It was subtle, but it was systemic. Someone had manipulated the numbers, ensuring that people like James were deemed less qualified. With the evidence in hand, James decided to confront Diane. He found her in her office, her desk piled with papers and her face tight with stress. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "James," she said, her tone guarded. "What can I do for you?" He placed the documents on her desk, his voice steady but firm. "I think you already know." For a moment, Diane didn't move. Her eyes scanned the papers, her face betraying a flicker of recognition. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "James, you don't know what you're getting yourself into." Her voice was quiet, almost pleading. But James didn't flinch. "I think I do," he replied. "And I think you've known about this for a long time." Diane hesitated, the conflict in her eyes impossible to ignore. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "There's a lot more going on here than you realize." Her words were a confirmation, but they also left James with more questions than answers. What exactly was she protecting? And how deep did the corruption go? Determined to unearth the full truth, James and Maria began their investigation with quiet but resolute determination. Their first step was to reach out to former employees, people who had quietly disappeared from the company after years of feeling unseen, undervalued, and ultimately defeated. Each conversation told a familiar story: projects being stolen, promotions dangled but never delivered, and performance reviews unfairly skewed to keep them out of leadership roles. These stories weren't just anecdotes. They were pieces of a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture of systemic bias. One call, however, stood out. It was with Marcus, a former manager who had resigned abruptly 2 years earlier. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been silenced for too long. "It's bigger than you think," Marcus said cautiously. "They're not just discriminating, they're profiting from it." Profiting. The word lingered in James's mind as he and Maria dug deeper. Late one night, Maria stumbled upon an old email thread buried in her files, a set of messages accidentally forwarded to her years ago, but quickly forgotten. The emails revealed something shocking: explicit instructions from Richard to department heads, advising them to maintain a consistent image in leadership roles. While the wording was vague, the implications were clear. Minorities weren't part of the company's vision for leadership. But this wasn't just about maintaining appearances. As Maria continued to comb through the emails, she found something far more damning. Among the threads was a document marked confidential. The file contained a breakdown of financial projections linked to government contracts. James and Maria read in stunned silence as they pieced together what it meant. The company had been strategically hiring and promoting certain demographics to meet the superficial requirements of diversity quotas for lucrative government deals. But behind closed doors, Richard had implemented practices to ensure minorities were excluded from meaningful positions of power. It was a calculated game: play the part of a progressive company while systematically undermining true equity, all for profit. Maria's hands trembled as she closed her laptop. "This isn't just discrimination," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is fraud." The weight of their discovery was overwhelming, but it also fueled their determination. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore, they were exposing corruption at the highest levels of their company. Armed with their findings, James and Maria decided it was time to confront Richard directly. They waited until late in the evening, long after most employees had left. Richard's office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and meticulously curated decor, felt more like a throne room than a workspace. As they entered, Richard glanced up from his desk, his face a mask of polite curiosity. But the moment he saw the stack of documents in Maria's hands, his expression shifted to something colder, more calculating. "James, Maria," Richard said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe this late-night visit?" His tone dripped with fausse charm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. James wasted no time. He dropped the stack of papers onto Richard's desk, the weight of them echoing in the silent room. "You know exactly why we're here," James said, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "We know what you've been doing. The discriminatory practices. The fraud. It's all here." For a moment, Richard said nothing, his fingers steepled as he studied them. Then, he let out a low chuckle. "You've been busy," he said, his tone almost amused. "But let me give you some advice. You're playing a dangerous game. This isn't just about a promotion anymore." His words were laced with warning, but James refused to flinch. "No," James replied, his gaze unwavering. "It's about integrity and justice, something you clearly lack." Richard's amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? Your word against mine. I could bury you in legal fees before you even get the chance to speak." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And if you think this won't cost you your job, think again. I can have your termination papers on my desk by tomorrow morning." The threat hung heavy in the air, but James and Maria stood firm. "You can fire us if you want," Maria said, her voice steady. "But we're not the only ones who know the truth. And once this gets out, there won't be a corner of this industry where you can hide." Her words landed like a blow, and for the first time, Richard looked uncertain. But it was fleeting. He leaned back again, regaining his composure. "You have no proof," he said dismissively. "And even if you did, you wouldn't dare use it. The risk is too high." But James knew better. The risk wasn't just in staying silent, it was in letting Richard continue to abuse his power unchecked. As they left the office, James felt a sense of resolve he hadn't experienced before. The fight was far from over, but now they had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to stop until justice was served. James sat at his kitchen table, the room dimly lit by a single lamp. Before him lay the culmination of weeks of research, incriminating emails, leaked HR records, and financial documents. The weight of what he held wasn't lost on him. This was no longer just his fight, it was a battle for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, and wronged. Across from him, Maria studied her phone, scrolling through potential journalists who might take the story. "We need someone fearless," she said, her voice resolute. "Someone who won't back down." That someone turned out to be Rebecca Carter, a renowned investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. Rebecca listened intently as James and Maria laid everything out for her during a late-night meeting at a quiet diner. Her eyes narrowed as she flipped through the documents, her expression shifting from curiosity to outrage. "This is huge," she said, leaning forward. "But if we're going to do this, we do it right. No anonymous sources. We need you both to go public." James hesitated for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Going public meant risking everything: his job, his reputation, his family's privacy. But as he looked at Maria, he knew they had no other choice. "We're in," he said firmly. The story broke 2 days later, and the impact was immediate. Headlines splashed across major news outlets: corporate giant exposed, systemic racism and corruption at the top. Rebecca's article detailed every aspect of the scandal, from the discriminatory practices to the fraudulent government contracts. Within hours, social media exploded. Employees from other companies began sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination under the hashtag #NotJustHere. The movement gained traction, with thousands of voices joining the chorus, demanding accountability and justice. At the center of the storm, James and Maria became unlikely heroes. The media clamored for interviews, but they chose to make their first public appearance at a press conference organized by Rebecca. Standing before a crowd of reporters, cameras, and supporters, James took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady. "It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. It's about the systems that allow people like Richard to thrive while others are held back. And it stops now." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy palpable. One by one, other employees stepped forward to share their own experiences, their voices amplifying the call for change. As the scandal continued to dominate headlines, the company found itself under intense scrutiny. Government agencies launched investigations and lawsuits began piling up. But the most significant blow came when Diane, the HR officer who had once been too afraid to act, decided to come forward as a whistleblower. Her testimony became the cornerstone of the legal case against Richard and the company. In the packed courtroom, Diane took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "For years I saw things I knew weren't right," she began, her voice breaking. "But I was scared of losing my job, my livelihood. It wasn't until James and Maria showed me their courage that I found mine." She went on to recount how performance reviews were manipulated, how candidates were dismissed based on appearance rather than merit, and how Richard had personally directed efforts to maintain the company's discriminatory practices. Her words were powerful, each one chipping away at the defense's crumbling case. Other witnesses followed, each one adding to the damning narrative. Former employees described instances of blatant racism, jokes made in meetings, opportunities withheld without explanation, and careers derailed simply because they didn't fit the mold. The prosecution's case reached its peak when they presented the financial records Maria had uncovered, showing how Richard had exploited diversity quotas to secure government contracts while simultaneously sabotaging true inclusivity within the company. Richard's defense team tried to argue that the allegations were exaggerated, that the emails were taken out of context, and that the financial practices were standard industry procedures. But their arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The emails, the testimonies, the leaked documents, it was all too much to deny. As the trial wore on, Richard's once confident demeanor began to crack. By the time he took the stand, he was a shadow of the man who had once ruled his company with an iron fist. In the final moments of the trial, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument. "This case is about more than one man or one company," they said. "It's about a culture that allows discrimination to thrive under the guise of professionalism. It's about holding those in power accountable, no matter how untouchable they believe they are." The courtroom fell silent as the jury deliberated, the weight of the case hanging heavy in the air. When the verdict was finally read, the room erupted. Guilty on all counts. Richard was led away in handcuffs, his empire in ruins. For James, Maria, and everyone who had fought alongside them, it was a moment of vindication, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be dismantled when people are brave enough to stand together. In the weeks following the trial, the corporate world felt the aftershocks of the scandal. The company, once a titan of its industry, was now synonymous with discrimination and corruption. News outlets reported on the massive fines levied against them, tens of millions of dollars for violating labor laws and committing fraud. But the financial penalties were only the beginning. Under mounting pressure from shareholders and regulators, the company announced a complete restructuring of its leadership team. Richard's resignation was swift and unceremonious. The man who had once wielded power so arrogantly was now a pariah, his name tarnished beyond repair. Cameras captured him leaving the company headquarters for the last time, his head bowed and his steps hurried as reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. It was a stark contrast to the confident, untouchable figure he had once been. Meanwhile, Diane's journey came full circle. After her courageous testimony, she became a symbol of integrity within the company. The board, desperate to repair their image, offered her the position of CEO, a move that sent a powerful message about accountability and change. Diane accepted, but only under the condition that the company implement sweeping reforms. Under her leadership, the company rolled out new diversity-focused policies, overhauled its hiring practices, and established an independent oversight committee to ensure lasting accountability. The changes were a start, but Diane knew rebuilding trust would take years. As for James and Maria, their paths took a different turn. Recognizing the systemic nature of the problem, they declined the company's offers of higher positions. Instead, they chose to start their own consultancy firm, one dedicated to helping organizations create truly inclusive workplaces. Their firm, aptly named Equity in Action, quickly gained attention, with companies across the country seeking their expertise. "We're not just fixing problems," Maria said during an interview. "We're creating environments where people can thrive." With the case behind him, James took time to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy, the sleepless nights, the emotional toll, the constant battle against doubt. But standing up for what was right had been worth every moment. James eventually accepted a position at a new company, one that had been lauded for its commitment to diversity and inclusion. From his first day, he noticed the difference. Meetings were collaborative, leadership was diverse, and employees were valued for their contributions, not their appearances. For the first time in years, James felt like he belonged. His story didn't just change his life, it inspired countless others. Messages poured in from people who had read about his fight in the news or watched his press conference. One message, in particular, stood out. It was a handwritten letter from a young professional named Aisha, who had faced similar struggles in her own workplace. The letter read, "Dear James, I just wanted to say thank you. Your courage to speak out gave me the strength to do the same. Because of you, I'm no longer afraid to stand up for myself. You've shown me that change is possible." James read the letter twice, his chest tightening with emotion. He thought back to the countless moments he had felt invisible, dismissed, or unworthy. Those moments no longer defined him. Instead, they had become fuel for something greater, a movement, a message, a legacy. James placed the letter in a drawer, not to hide it away, but to keep it safe. It was a reminder of why he had fought, and why he would continue to fight. The final scene fades to James sitting on a park bench, watching his children play. The sun is setting, casting a warm golden light across the park. As he gazes at them, a small smile crosses his face. He knows the world isn't perfect, and the fight for equity is far from over. But for now, he allows himself a moment of peace, knowing that he's helped make the future a little brighter for them and for so many others. James's journey didn't end with the courtroom verdict, or the corporate fallout, or even the promotion of a new, more inclusive CEO. It was bigger than that. His story became a beacon for those who had been silenced, ignored, and pushed aside. James's courage wasn't just his own, it was the courage of every person who has ever faced discrimination and decided to stand tall. It was the voice of every individual who, despite being knocked down, found the strength to fight back, to demand fairness, and to seek justice. But here's the thing, James's story isn't just about one man. It's about countless individuals who face discrimination every single day, hidden in plain sight, often overlooked, dismissed, or quietly silenced. It's about the systemic structures that keep them in the shadows, just waiting for someone brave enough to step into the light and shine a spotlight on the truth. It's about you and me, and the collective power we hold when we stand together, when we speak up, when we share our stories, when we demand change. You see, this isn't just a story of what happened, it's a call to action. A call to action for anyone who has ever felt overlooked, underappreciated, or discriminated against. It's time to stand up. It's time to share your experiences, whether it's in the workplace, in education, or in any other part of life where you've encountered injustice. It's time to hold institutions, organizations, and individuals accountable for their actions. And when they try to silence you, when they try to push you back into the shadows, speak louder. Speak with courage. Speak with conviction. The power to make change doesn't lie solely in the hands of those who hold positions of power. It lies in all of us. Every story shared, every voice raised, contributes to the bigger picture. Together we can make a difference. Together we can create a world where equality is not just a distant dream, but a daily reality. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And when we come together, we create a ripple that has the power to transform the future for everyone. If you've been moved by James's story, if you found inspiration in the fight for justice, I encourage you to share your story in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's build a community of support and empowerment, where everyone's voice is heard and no one is left behind. And if you want to see more stories of resilience, of people who have fought back against injustice and made a difference, stay tuned. This is just the beginning. In our next video, we'll dive into another story of courage, of standing up for what's right, and of the battles that are still being fought. Don't miss it. Thank you for watching. Together we can change the world one story at a time.